If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what the most disturbing or creepy thing that you've ever witnessed? Was riding the subway and saw a guy dressed as a clown talking to a 20-something hipster girl across the aisle from him. This wasn't a fun circus type clown outfit, think sleazy grease paint over day old stubble, stained clothing type clown. Anyway, the girl seemed to be tolerating the conversation, not actively engaged in it. When she finally got up and got off the train, the clown stood up and went across the aisle, pressed his face against his seat and sniffed it loudly, then looked up at the rest of us with an unabashed grin on his face. I used to be an EMT and we got a call for a multiple car collision. We get on scene and there are a few injuries among the car drivers, but nothing too serious. Going through each person, I noticed a man kneeling on the ground facing away from me. I ran up and asked if he was hurt and noticed he was holding his son. Apparently one of the cars hit and killed the kid while the dad and son were walking. I put my hand on his shoulder. The dad was so grief-stricken he was not breathing, and when he finally took a breath, he screamed like something I've never heard before. That still haunts me. No one should have to see their child die. I was at a movie alone, and I came out to get some soda, and there was a guy waiting outside the theater just looking. Ugh. I came out 45 minutes later to pee and the guy was in the movie theater just standing around in the lobby. There was something totally out of place about him. Dressed normal for the area, but he was looking around nervously and trying to avoid any sort of eye contact. So I look at the movie times and there are like 3 kids' movies getting out in a half hour. I ask him, "Are you waiting for your kids to get out of a movie?" And he fucking booked it out the door. It was a theater in a mostly empty strip mall and it was like 40 degrees Fahrenheit out, so he probably wasn't out for a stroll. I don't know if he was just a weirdo or if he had actual nefarious intentions, but it stuck with me. Last year, my sister was shot in the head. She survived, but they had to take her eyes out from the bullet just destroying them, and was in a drug-induced coma, for probably a week. She couldn't breathe on her own, so they had to give her a tracheotomy. Well, with that comes having to change the tubes, to put in sterile new ones. I remember telling myself not to look. So I watched. It was only a 5 seconds process, but when they pulled that tube out, her body went into complete panic. The way her body was trying so hard to get air was horrible to see. She is good now and adapting to being blind, but man, that shit me up. Some friends and I were driving around California while on spring break at college, just smoking pot and checking out the state and national parks. I took a walk into the woods to go pee while my friends hung out near the car and waited. And about 20 or so feet into the woods, right where I stopped to pee, was a homemade sex doll propped up against the tree. Had hair on its head and on its and had breasts and holes where breasts and holes would be needed. And I had no idea if the creator of the thing was anywhere near there. So I hustled back to the safety of my friends, and told them what I saw. They bolted to go check it out, and it was gone. So whomever had made it was close enough to grab it and leave in the few moments between I went to the car and my friends got to the tree. I was a cashier at a local grocery and I saw an unkempt old man with a scraggly gray, dirty beard. He came to my line pushing his cart swiftly and avoiding eye contact. From behind him came 2 or 3 young girls dressed in dirty Amish-looking clothes. Like they lived in the prairie. I live in a city with no Amish and no farms nearby. My mind tried to justify it, thinking maybe they were just passing through. I tried to say, "Are you okay?" with my eyes to one of the girls. She just looked at me confused. I kept my eyes on her as she bagged the groceries. They looked uncomfortable and in my heart I knew something was wrong. I glared at the guy and watched their every move as they left, trying to find any sign of distress. Our registers were right in front of large windows that looked over the parking lot. The next person in line came through with their groceries and I couldn't stop looking out into the parking lot. I saw them load their things in a truck and leave. I wanted so badly to see one little sign that would affirm my unease towards the whole thing and prompt me to call the police. It was the most chilling thing I have ever seen and I felt helpless. I was fairly young and naive. I told my parents about it when I went home, and my dad said I should have called someone. I tried to talk to my coworkers to see if they noticed it and if they had the same feeling I had, but they were all in their own little worlds. All they could do was shrug and say, "There's a lot of weird people in the world." Although I never really forgot about it, I just let it go and tried to shake it off. Well, last year, this story came up on the news and I saw the face of this man once again. I nearly cried. I could have saved these girls 4 years earlier. I grew up in rural western Kentucky. From age 8 until I graduated high school, my mom, dad, younger brother, and I lived way out in the woods. Essentially, for thousands and thousands of acres, it was just us and 3 other families that owned the land. This area was along the Cumberland River. Every year I lived there. A few days before Halloween, the barely paved county road that allowed us and the other families get to our homes would become a path for a large caravan of bikers. Real bikers. Sometimes as many as 40 or 50. They always waved, never menaced us, just drove by. For a couple years we had no idea why they came down. My parents eventually asked the man who once owned all the property in the area who they were. I don't know what he told them, but they told me, I'm around 11 or so at this point, that I was to leave them alone. They were bad people and referred to them as devil worshippers, and they sacrificed babies, probably just a gang that got from the woods, but it still scared me. Anyway, one day my dad and I went out to ride our 4-wheelers on miles and miles of trails. After an hour or two my dad and I stopped so he can have a few beers, alcoholic, and while we are stopped, we can see maybe 500 or 600 yards down in a sort of valley and we notice where these devil worshippers were camped out. Make a mental note and go on with our day. A few days later we see the bikes leaving for the year and Dad and I head back to their camp. Walking around we find beer cans and other signs of camp, no biggie. We go to the far end of camp and there's a huge fire pit encircled by stones and about 10 feet in front of that are 4 posts in the ground that look like maybe they held a platform or something. Hear Dad shout shit and look over towards the direction of his gaze. Some sort of deer skull was hanging from a tree. Dad says we gotta go. On our way back to our ATVs, Dad notices something else around the fire pit ashes. It was a pacifier. Probably just normal bikers and their families hanging out and having fun, but the combo of the skull and pacifier after being told they were devil worshippers who killed babies creeped me out for several years. I was out camping at Wilderness State Park in northern Michigan, just west of Mackinac City. It was a group camping thing where my brother and I got together with about 15 of our friends and we rented out a few lots and pitched our tents right in the middle of this RV park on the campground. The place was adjacent to a national dark sky park where no white light is permitted in the nighttime, i.e. from flashlights or your cell phone or etc., so that you can look at the stars with as little light pollution as possible. We did bring red bulb flashlights as they don't emit the same type of light pollution. And we stayed out looking at the stars until about 3 a.m. until we drove back to the campsite. Everyone decided to go to sleep except for me, my brother, and 2 of our friends. We wanted to walk from our campsite to the beach, which was just down the road, and maybe keep looking at the stars till dawn. Now earlier, when it was still daylight, I had noticed a path that broke off from the main road, and a sign that said auditorium. I am a naturally curious person who likes to explore my surroundings, so I made a mental note to check it out later. So we start walking towards the beach and we approach the path. I'm leading the group so I decide fuck it, let's check out the auditorium, see what it's all about. The rest of the group agrees and we get out our red flashlights and start walking down the path. I figured it would be a relatively short walk to the auditorium, but it was a longer and more winding path than we had anticipated. We suddenly heard a high-pitched squawk that sounded like a bird dying and at this point we all stopped, unsure of whether we wanted to commit to keep walking this path. My brother was now in the front of the line so it was his move. He said I'm not sure what we should do here. To which I said, follow your instinct. My instinct was to turn back now and head back to camp, but he just kept on walking and we followed. So as we got further down the path, we started hearing this low-pitched growling sound coming from our right which increased in loudness and intensity until we finally reached the clearing where the auditorium was. At this point the sound got louder. Now it was surrounding us on all sides, and it was absolutely the most terrifying sound I had heard in my life, like a combination of a bear eating away at a carcass, demonic mutterings, and something moving across creaking wood. We shined our red lights onto the auditorium, this old rickety wooden stage that had this cartoonish backdrop curtain all tattered and ripped apart. But what was really unsettling was that in front of this curtain, on the stage, was a single folding chair, facing away from us. I started to get déjà vu. This very striking, this seems familiar, I've been here before. Feeling, while also getting some serious Blair Witch Project vibes as we ran our red flashlights over the stage. One of our friends who was with us was just absolutely giddy, like the first person who dies in a horror movie. She started laughing really hard and walking towards the stage and I go, nope. We are leaving here right now. And I turned around and near sprinted back up the path with the rest of the gang following. The sound followed us out and we could hear it well until we walked back to the campsite. At this point said to going to the beach. The next morning my brother pulled me aside. I hadn't told him about the déjà vu. I have to ask you something. Did you get this feeling last night like that had happened to us before? He wanted to go back and explore and I said, you can, but I'm not going back there. That second night at camp, I set off again towards the beach with the same two friends, but not my brother, who decided to call it an early night. I knew we'd have to pass the entrance to the auditorium path again on our way to the beach, and I was nervous, but we all agreed that we would just keep walking without faltering. So as we approached the path entrance, we heard that same growling again, this time as if it was coming right from the trees to the right of us. We walked straight onward to the beach and no strangeness followed us this time. When we walked back to the campsite to call it a night and passed the auditorium entrance again, it was absolutely silent. As if something was trying to lure us back in the first time and considered us a lost cause after we ignored it. I worked as a lifeguard last summer at the local pool. Normal things happen, like rescuing people who couldn't swim from the diving well and patching up kids who scraped themselves because they were running on deck. One day while I was about to get onto the stand at the diving well, and as I was walking, I saw a little boy trying to turn back from the high dive. He made it to the edge of the board but got scared and turned back. As he was trying to hurry to get off the board, he slipped and fell. He hit his head right on the edge of the pool and ragdolled into the water. The guard on stand made the long whistle blow, but since I was closer on the ground, I was the first to get to the kid. Anybody who's a lifeguard will know how difficult it is to backboard somebody for the first time for real. Once we had him on the board and out of the water, the ambulance had arrived, and as he was transferred onto the stretcher, he came back around. What will be with me forever is how terrified he was. He woke up and screamed, "I don't want to go off. I want out of line." He thought he was still on the high dive. The paramedics couldn't calm him down, and the way he whimpered and wailed absolutely shook me to the bone. He died later in the evening because of brain hemorrhaging. His parents came to the pool after the funeral to thank the guards for doing what we could. Parents aren't meant to outlive their children, and I understood that when I saw the pain those parents were in. Down the street from my house there was a home with a swing set kinda close to the road. My dad is kind of a landscaping snob, you could say, and one morning on the way to school he commented on how it looked tacky in the yard because it was in front of the house and too close to the road. So it just kinda always stood out to me after that. Every time we passed it I'd look at the house. Came to notice there was a little blonde boy that lived there, out there playing on the swing set after school some days. He looked either 8 or 9. One morning on the way to school, an ambulance had just pulled in the driveway. As we passed by, what I'm assuming was the boy's father came bursting through the front door running towards the ambulance with the blonde boy in his arms just kind of flapping. You could tell by the way the body just flopped as he ran the boy was dead. It was only a few seconds because we were driving by the scene, but it felt like a lifetime. Eventually the swing set was removed from the yard. A schizophrenic episode. I witnessed a few while I worked in a psychiatric home for kids, but one I'll never forget was of course late at night and after a really long, shitty day of getting my ass kicked. I had the individual ready for bed and tucked the individual in bed after a short story. We had to stay sitting in the hallway to keep sight and sound on all individuals. Hallway was basically completely dark. I thought that our awful day was behind us and was looking forward to going home in 2 hours. About 5 minutes into thinking this, I hear the individual get out of bed. I can see their silhouette in front of the window of the bedroom. I whisper, "It's time for bed, name," then I heard a growl and scratching against the window. Oh fuck nah, here we go. I wasn't one to ever ask for help, as sometimes it escalates behaviors, so I plan ignore. Individual gets back on bed and I can see that they're sitting with their legs crossed and looking straight up with mouth open. Shit, I start kind of freaking out, some crazy shit about to happen. It was completely silent and then the individual starts screaming, "They're here." Over and over, the loudest, most ear-piercing scream I've ever heard in my life. My manager comes running to me and I can't move, am terrified. We nod at each other and mouth fuck. We both look into the bedroom. The individual snaps her head at us and continues screaming this while staring at us with this tormented look. I tell the individual that they are safe and it will be okay. I fucked up apparently because the individual came charging at me and attacked us both. I will never forget that scream and how demented it sounded. After being completely terrified, my heart broke for this individual. I can't imagine the terror of living with a mental illness like that, a never-ending fear. When I was 18 I suffered from anorexia. I had just gotten out of the hospital, and was very small and fragile looking. My best friend and I decided to celebrate my freedom by going to the movies, and were going to meet at the theater. I arrived before my friend, so I started walking up to the theater to wait for her. Seemingly out of nowhere, a man comes walking up to me. He was very tall, quite muscular, wearing nice jeans and a wife beater, but most strikingly he had blood running down his face. He asked me if he could please borrow my phone, that he had been injured and needed someone to come pick him up. I immediately agreed, handed him my phone, and waited for him to make his call. At the same time, my friend arrived and called out to me. The man finished his call, nobody answered, thanked me, and was on his way. I didn't think anything of it. We started to go into the theater, when my friend pointed out that the man was around the corner, and watching me. I thought it was weird, but wasn't worried. We bought our tickets, entered the theater, got snacks and found seats. We're chatting away, waiting for the previews to start, and my friend gets hushed suddenly, and I realize the man has entered the theater. He beelines towards me, and asks me to use my phone again. I pass it to him, but I'm starting to feel a little weirded out at this point. He makes a big deal of trying to find service, then asks if he can use my phone outside, since he can't get any bars. I protest, but he's insistent on it, so I tell him sure, go ahead. He asks me to come with him, I agree, and follow him out. At this point, all movies are in session. There's no one working in the box office, and this theater is kind of out in the boonies, there's no one around but this man and I. He dials, while walking away, looking back to make sure I'm following. He begins walking around the corner, slowly, making sure I'm following and that nobody is following me. At this point, the manager of the theater comes outside, and yells at the man to get back. The man sees the manager, also a large, young guy, and freaking books it, running as fast as he can around the corner, throwing my phone in the bushes as he goes. I'm shaken, and a little confused. The manager is on the phone with the police, who show up shortly. They grab my phone from the bushes, and show me that this man never attempted to actually make any calls. They feel that the whole thing was an effort to get me around the corner, alone where a car was waiting to snatch me. They took it very seriously, even releasing the surveillance videos that showed the man luring me, and ultimately, him running around the corner, and jumping into a car that was waiting. They never found the guy. Luckily I wasn't harmed, and I even got my phone back. But I always wonder what his true intentions were, and how I ultimately could have ended up. There was an older couple that lived 2 doors down from my childhood house. The wife allegedly poisoned her husband with rat poison. She accidentally used the rat poison instead of baking soda in some cookies she made him. After that, she became a cat hoarder. At any given time, there were at least 30 cats in her yard and she had cat doors, so there were probably 30 more in her house. Well, she eventually died about 10 years after her husband. She had no family. So they taped up the house for a while. My friends and I decided to go in see what it was like. Stacks of magazines, trash everywhere, the cats had disappeared though. We went down into the basement. Holy Jesus. Freaking piles of dead cats at varying degrees of decomposition. Some were straight up mummified and some were still oozing. I have nothing to compare the smell to. Later, they had to bubble up the house and take it down board by board, because it was a biological hazard. Couldn't bulldoze it because of the shit that would get into the air. I probably should be dead from some dead cat bacteria or something. When I was about 19 years old, I was on my way to my boyfriend's house in the country. Around 10:45 p.m. or so I stopped at the last gas station to fill up. There was no one there except for a van and a police cruiser parked in the space by the door. I'm sitting here filling up my tank, when a semi comes to pull in the station. At that point I hear the sound of a motorcycle or dirt bike going really fast. I look to my left just in time to hear the loudest noise I've ever heard, and the body of a man flip under this semi and fly through the air like a ragdoll, landing not even 10 feet from where I was standing. He was mangled like I have never seen, coughing up blood and just staring at me. I look to my right, in shock, and see the people in the van just look at what happened and drive away. Something smacked me back to reality and I remembered the police cruiser, and bolted for the gas station door, where I couldn't even form words. I just yelled and pointed outside. The 2 cops ran out and immediately started performing CPR. About a minute later, all of these other guys on dirt bikes pull up, and subsequently watch their friend die. I ended up having to give a testimony that it wasn't the truck driver's fault. Apparently they had all been drinking and decided to go off-roading at night. Fucked up thing for a 19-year-old girl to experience by herself. About 10 years ago I was working as a private investigator. It sounds cool but it's actually not. You spend about 3 to 5 hours each day driving to your cases, stake them out in a blazing hot car with the engine off for 8 hours and then spend 1 to 3 hours in a hotel room writing up your reports before finally getting some sleep and doing it all over again. I did this job for about a year after completing my training to be a medic in the Army Reserves. I was young at the time, so the idea of making $50K a year and traveling all over the country while living out of a suitcase seemed appealing to 19-year-old me. As I said above, you spend a lot of time driving in areas you are not necessarily familiar with. On one of these late nights I found myself driving on a twisting mountain road just outside of Taos, New Mexico. The area was heavily wooded with narrow roads that curved sharply without a lot of places to turn off since you were driving up and around mountains. In the middle of the night, as I maneuvered my rental vehicle through a curve, I saw a woman stumbling along the side of the road carrying a small child. The sight caught me off guard and sent a shiver down my spine. It was so unexpected and so out of place. There were no houses or businesses around me, and it was around 2 a.m. and pitch black. This unnerved me, but what sent the shiver down my spine was the way she moved. She lurched along with what I can only describe as a shuffle straight out of a George Romero zombie flick. And she didn't look up or acknowledge me as I drove by. She just stared aimlessly at the road in front of her. You have to remember, I was a 19-year-old that was fresh out of a year of extensive army training. I was in peak physical shape, and I thought I was Billy Badass at the time. I had spent a month working in a trauma center as part of my training, so I didn't and still don't get freaked out by these things, but this scared me. I drove on for a minute or two thinking about what I saw. Who was she? What was she doing out here at this time of night? How did she get here? The more rational part of my brain took over from my lizard brain, and I came to a horrifying realization. I had been driving for about 1.5 miles past her, and I hadn't seen any homes or businesses. Nor had I come across any places to turn off since I had seen her. And it had been about 10 miles since I had come across a place to turn before I saw her. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. I realized that she had to be hurt or in trouble. Perhaps she had been in a car accident and was in shock? What if the child she was carrying was hurt? I was a medic. I had trained for a year to help people. Sure, I was scared and unnerved, but how would I feel if I found out later they died of exposure on that mountain and I was too much of a coward to go back and help? Wouldn't I also be scared the first time I saw combat when my friends were depending on me? I had to man up and turn around. And as soon as it was safe, I did. I drove back to where I had seen her, half relieved and half horrified when I didn't find her. I traced the road 6 times. Where could she have gone? There was only a small area on the side of the road and guardrails for miles. I drove and turned around and drove and turned around and drove and turned around. I was obsessed with finding her or finding what had happened. Part of it was out of concern for her and her child. Part of it was about proving to myself that I would do the right thing with my training even when I was scared shitless. After a while, however, it became about me proving to myself that I wasn't insane. I spent hours looking for her. Eventually I stopped my car and started walking along the road looking for any signs of her or any disturbances on the mountain to indicate a vehicle had crashed off the road and down the mountain. I walked that entire 3-mile stretch of road in pitch black with a flashlight, at times yelling like a madman, listening to every twig and echo with bated breath. I didn't even care about my deadline or my next case. I was so sure of what I saw that I was all in. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't seeing things. I wasn't overly tired. I saw her stumbling down that road, there is no doubt in my mind. The image is etched in my memory. But there was nothing. Even when the sun came up and I drove that stretch of road another 6 times, there was nothing. And there were no ways for me to explain it away, even after countless sleepless nights in the 10 years since devoted to it. I don't believe in ghosts. I see the BS documentaries and laugh away their evidence and stupid orbs like the rest of you do, but I also don't know where the hell the stumbling woman and her child came from or where they went. So on the off chance you were stumbling down a windy road in Taos, New Mexico about 10 years ago with a toddler in your arms, please tell me what the hell happened, where you came from, where you went, and that you are both okay. I've been puzzled by it for a decade now. When I was a child, my mom was a single mother, and we rented a house a little out of the city. We all slept in my mom's bed, for various reasons, but mostly just because we were young, and that's what we liked to do. One night, I woke up to the most horrific screaming and crying coming from outside, and soon after, someone pounding on our door. It almost sounded like they were trying to kick it down. My mom was up in a flash, telling us to lock the bedroom door behind her, as she ran to look outside. We were all silent, terrified and worried for our mama. The woman outside our door, still banging and screaming, was yelling, "Help me. He's going to kill me. Please let me in." My mom was on the phone with 911, in tears, saying, "I can't let you in. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. My children are in here. I can't open the door. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. Hang on. The police are on their way." The woman continued screaming and crying, then suddenly it was silent. The police came and looked around the outside of our house, unable to find anyone. I was around 5 when this happened, and I still wonder what happened to that woman. My mom still feels guilty to this day about not being able to open the door to help her. Driving home on a country road at night. The two cars in front of me stop right on the road and the driver of the first goes to each car asking for a phone. This was 15 years ago, so not everyone had one. I had no clue what was going on, but more and more vehicles were stopping, even in the other direction. Finally, a truck pulled into the field opposite me and turned with its lights shining directly into my car. Laying in the lane right next to me was a body silhouetted by the headlights. Turns out it was a guy riding his bike to work. The guy that hit him drove off thinking he had hit a deer. I heard the driver was really upset with himself, but I don't know for sure. It was the only time I had seen a dead body outside of a funeral. Driving home with some friends late one night, we come upon what looks like a bag of garbage in the road. It was on the other side of a hill, so by the time I saw it, I barely had time to react and avoid it. We get to our destination a few miles down the road and one of the guys says he wants to go back and look at that bag. Something didn't seem right to him. We go back and pull of the side of the road, get out and put flashlights on it. At that point the bag starts moving. We did not expect that. It rolls around for a bit and by this time we know it's a person. It's groaning and making spitting sounds. We decide we should probably get the out of the road and start waking toward it. Suddenly it moves quickly and gets up. It's a guy and it appears he is wearing a big garbage bag like a poncho. His face is pretty beaten/bloody and he is not in good shape. We ask if he's okay and he answers with "I have to get rid of it." He repeats this again, except this time he screams it. We try to get him off the road and he runs the other way, down a ditch and through a field. At this point he is moving like he's in speed or something. We decided that since he was off the road we'd just let him go and let the police know what we'd seen. When I was in college in Oregon I went scuba diving in a small freshwater lake that was spring-fed and pretty deep. The spot was also popular because one side had a high cliff and a waterfall, so people would dive in off the rocks. As I was exploring the bottom I saw something white ahead of me in the murky water, and getting closer I realized it was a person laying face down on the bottom. He was wearing a diving mask, so my first thought was he was trying to see how long he could hold his breath, but when I got even closer I could see there were crayfish in his hair. To this day I vividly remember the feeling of what felt like a hand pulling me away from him, but what felt like another hand pulling me closer. The feeling seemed like it went on forever, but I know it was only a few seconds. I pulled him up off the bottom, got my arm around his chest and took him to the surface where I yelled for help. Lots of folks jumped in and helped me get him to shore and we started CPR on him. It took paramedics about 20 minutes to get there and during that time he never showed any sign of life. Then they loaded him into an ambulance and took him away. Later that evening a state trooper called to let me know that he never regained consciousness. It turned out that he was there with friends but they got separated, and he must have hit his head diving in. Trooper also told me the guy's half-brother had drowned in the same spot almost exactly a year prior. Every once in a while I'll dream about it even though it was more than 20 years ago. In 2005, my friends and I went to work cleaning up after Katrina. We ended up in a rental trailer in Moss Bluff, Louisiana with a couple of guys from Austin that we didn't know. Long story short, one guy got pissed at the other and started beat the other with 14 inches pipe wrench while simultaneously stabbing him with a 12 inches Phillips screwdriver. The victim was stabbed 33 times, while being beaten, before one of my friends shot the assailant in the back of the head at point blank. This happened in the living room, quicker than you can imagine. 1 minute total, tops. The victim survived, and the shooter was acquitted. That's my horror story. When I was 18, I used to be DD for my boyfriend most of the times he went drinking. One of their favorite spots was a friend's house where he lived with his mom and stepdad. Stepdad also happened to be the maintenance man at my church. Most nights they would all sit and play drinking games while I napped on the couch until it was time to go, but some nights, stepdad and I would sit around talking for hours. Nothing ever in particular, just bullshitting. About a year later, boyfriend and I broke up and I saw stepdad at church outside of his office, which was by the choir rehearsal room. I was in the choir. He told me he knew about my breakup, offered his condolences, then propositioned me. I nervously laughed and said no, and he started kind of begging for just one time. I became super creeped out and firmly said no and walked into the choir room with the rest of the choir. I told my ex about it and he just asked me what I expected after talking to him so much and leading him on. I didn't tell anyone else for years, thinking maybe it was my own fault. I know now it wasn't and he's just some creep. He was let go from the church a few months later. I've thankfully never seen him again. Sleep paralysis. I recently had a few moments of it a month ago, but my real experience with it was when I was about 13. I had fallen asleep watching TV during the summer, as usual. I woke up and at first nothing seemed odd. Then I realized I couldn't move and I started to panic. I tried to call for help, but nothing would come out of my mouth but my normal breathing. I must have been locked in a half-dream state as I looked towards the door and saw what looked like a shadowy figure. I thought it was my mom at first, and again, I tried to call out but no sound would come out. I was aware enough that I started looking around. I urged my body to move, to struggle, to speak, anything. But I was trapped inside my unconscious body. The terror was raising and I looked back at the shadowy figure and I felt a sensation of it rushing towards me. It looked to me a bit like the dolly zoom effect. Right then I broke out of the paralysis, shot upright, breathing heavily and shaking. I looked around and everything was normal again. At the time I had no idea what happened, nor did I learn about sleep paralysis until many years later. For a long time I thought I'd had some kind of supernatural experience despite not believing in such things. It was quite unpleasant to say the least. My brief experiences with it recently were equally panic-inducing, but at least I knew what it was and it only lasted a few seconds, rather than minutes the first time. When I was going to high school, we lived about 2 miles away. This was 2002 to 2006, so it was before people started getting really paranoid about letting their kids walk home alone. Plus, my parents were baby boomers and had raised 5 boys before me, so they were pretty old school about that kind of stuff. Anyway, I walked home the same route every day. It was about 2 blocks of main road, then I would turn off onto suburban road with minimal traffic. The last half of the walk was around the middle school I lived across from. I would often stop and talk to people, since it was a generally friendly neighborhood and close enough to my house that I felt comfortable. I must have been 14 or 15, and noticed this particular old man riding his bike slowly by me a few times a week. I didn't get worried at first, because I never saw him for long. Then during one week I saw him several times, popping up along various parts of my route, and I realized he's following me home. One day he stopped the bike and asked me, seemingly casually, if I was walking home alone again. The way he said it made it sound as if he were trying to calculate how long I would be home alone. Well, one of my older brothers was living with us at the time as well, and he would get home from work not long after I got home from school. I told him what happened, he immediately drove out, bought me pepper spray, I started changing up my route home, and he bought a padlock for the gate that led to the yard. I never saw the guy again, lucky for me. I was a locksmith for many years and I met a lot of very strange people and came across a lot of disturbing situations. Alzheimer's patients living alone are very unnerving for certain, but the absolute strangest, most disturbing call I ever received? That's an easy win. Elderly Matilda had taken custody of her deadbeat son Bob's daughter, Chandra. Chandra was mentally disabled, more than a little bit autistic, and it made it difficult for her to live on her own. So Matilda had taken Chandra in, needing the physical help and being able to help provide some stability and a healthy living environment for the girl. Matilda had also maintained a good relationship with Debbie, Bob's ex-wife, so by the time this story happened, Bob was long gone and Debbie was doing her best to help a woman who she was no longer related to. Chandra and Matilda had gone to the grocery store a week before I was called over. Matilda always rode in the back when Chandra drove, and so, when they arrived at home, Matilda was in the back seat. Chandra grabbed the groceries, took them inside and left Matilda in the car. In August. During the day. About 6 hours later, a neighbor arrived home from work and saw Matilda still in the back of the car, slumped over. After a brief panic and a call to 911, Matilda was rushed to the hospital, unconscious and unresponsive. They were able to revive her, and a few days later, she was released to the care of Debbie, who took her back home. The emergency personnel had not retrieved the keys to the house, and so I was called to come unlock the door and let them in. After a few minutes, I had managed to pick the lock, and as the door swung open I saw Chandra literally drop to her hands and feet on all fours and skittered into the house like a deranged, wild animal. She ran through the house and to a back room out of sight. Matilda brought up cash to pay me and I left as quickly as possible. The juxtaposition of this helpless, frail old woman and the skittering monster in charge of her bodily safety has haunted me for years. Creepiest experience I had was driving along a highway with a friend and her son. We hit some traffic and after about 10 minutes we saw emergency lights in the distance. The vehicles were on the opposite side, but for whatever reason our side slowed to a crawl. We were running late and so I angrily blurted, "What happened? Why are we slowed?" Her 3-year-old son quietly said, "The big man died." His mother immediately told him, "Don't speak like that." He continued playing with his toy and did not say anything else. Finally, after another 5 minutes we passed the scene. Clear as day I watched 2 first responders kneeling at this guy. One was pumping on his chest. He was real big, like 280 plus pounds. I clearly remember each time they would pump his chest, his stomach would puff up. My friend looked at me and we both looked back. She then asked her son who was playing, "Why did you say that earlier about the big man?" He then acted like he did not know what we were talking about. He said he could not remember. It was weird because at the time we were too far for him to see anything. I also won't forget that we were so excited for our outing, but when we hit traffic everything became so depressed. I later read in the paper this guy had a heart attack causing him to lose control of his truck and he crashed into several cars. He died and his truck caused some serious damage to the people around him. During Halloween one year some friends and I went to a rave in a different city and stayed at a hotel afterwards. There's like 6 or 7 of us staying in 2 rooms. One friend of mine and myself walk out of the room and downstairs to go have a smoke. While walking past a different room we very distinctly hear the sound of a girl saying things like "No, stop, please God, no," things like this. So after hearing this we go to the front office and tell the person working there, who was zero help, so we walk back and decide to knock on the door. An older woman, not the voice we heard, cracks the door open and sticks her head out. We told her we were from the office and got a complaint. Being a couple of young kids who just got back from a rave on Halloween, it's obvious that we weren't from the office. She says, "Yeah, right, you're from the office?" and slammed the door in our faces. At this point we hear whispering inside, so we decided to call the cops. We let the cops do their thing and we go back to the room where a few friends are and we told them what happened. So as if that wasn't creepy enough, later in the night when we're all passed out, we wake up to a knock at the door and somebody holding their finger over the peephole. Everyone is totally silent. A knock at the door turns to an aggressive pounding on the door and 2 men talking to each other while everyone inside is freaking out. After about 10 minutes they left. That's all we ever heard about it. I was 18 and it was New Year's Eve. We usually celebrated on my grandparents' house along with other relatives. An hour before New Year, me and my cousin are on our way to deliver some fireworks to his girlfriend's house. It's a 30 minutes travel, back and forth, and we're hurrying cause we don't want to miss the fireworks prepared by our grandpa. We're in a tricycle, a motorcycle with a sidecar and a roof, and I was at the back while the sidecar is full of fireworks. Then we came across this empty road not far away from our destination. I was staring blankly on the road after us, and I saw a faint light coming closer. Another tricycle, also with 2 passengers. Perhaps they also have a business of their own midst away from New Year. It gets closer and closer until the front wheel of their bike is just inches away from the back wheel of ours. I try to look at their faces, but their light is shining bright at my face I can't see. So I focused again on the distance of the wheels. I was afraid they might touch and we'll get to an accident. I remember them laughing and grinning on my worried face. It was then I saw their wheel wiggled, causing their vehicle to slow down and move to other side of the road. Still losing control, they hit the curb on the other side and flipped 720 degrees in midair. Then they hit the trees. It happened all too fast. We didn't stop to check. We figured we'd drop the fireworks first. And so we did. When we come back, nothing's there. Trees were unharmed. I remember cause there's a signage near where they crashed. Me and my cousin was really creeped out cause we can't explain WTF just happened. We just went back home and enjoyed my grandpa's bulletless cannon. I've been a home inspector for about 3 years now, and this one home I did about a month ago will stick with me forever. So I show up to the house which was vacant and start doing my normal routine on the outside before I pop inside and continue. Nothing seemed out of the norm while I was inspecting the exterior, but when I opened the screen door at the front of the home I knew something was up. The front door had been kicked in, and when I walked inside there was blood all over the walls in the living room. I'm not talking a little blood, more like shit you see in cheesy horror flicks. The smell alone made me dry heave instantly. I turned around immediately and called my boss, who in turn told me to call the police. The police showed up and I told the officer what I had seen. Both officers go into the house to check things out while I waited outside. They come out about 5 minutes later and asked me to give a statement, which I did. Once I was done giving the statement, he told me that they'll give me a call if they have any more questions. I said no problem, put my ladder and bag in the back of my work truck, and as I'm leaving I see them putting crime scene tape up around the perimeter of the home. I never did get a call from the police and never did find out what happened in that home, but that shit still gives me the creeps just thinking about it. I was about 8, maybe 9, in my room reading around midnight. My light and fan go off at the same time, so I think it's a power outage, happens quite often in my town. So I sit there waiting for it to come back on, but I realize it's not a power outage because I hear my brother's fan from across the hall. I'm creeped out now because why just my room? Then light and fan come back on and there is this woman standing in the mirror. She's wearing a white nightgown and has long gray hair. I slowly closed my book, walked out of the room, and went downstairs. I figured my imagination was really weird, so I went to get a drink of water from the fridge. It wouldn't open no matter how hard I pulled on it. So I thought I was too sleepy, so I was weak. I went to the living room and tried to sleep on the couch. Then I heard footsteps from upstairs, come downstairs, walk through the kitchen, and stand in the doorway to the living room. I hear breathing and I'm now panicking. I look and see nothing, but I still hear the breathing. After a while the breathing gets closer and I feel a hand go down my arm and leg. It then feels like someone curled up with me on the couch. I bolt up and run to my parents' room crying. They didn't believe me. For years my room feels odd, it did before, but it's a heavy feeling now. I can't go in my closet without feeling like someone is there. From 14 to 15 I slept on the couch because I couldn't handle the feeling in my room anymore. I begged my parents to switch with me and my mom agreed if I slept in my room one last time. I made her sleep with me because if I hadn't been in the room in over a year, I was not sleeping in there alone. I lay down and try to sleep when I feel arms wrap around me. I was laying on my side but I still felt an arm through the mattress. I cried as silent as I could so my mom wouldn't hear. She heard and asked me what was wrong. So I told her. Long story short, I didn't sleep in that room again. I switched rooms and can sleep peacefully at night.